Welcome to Resourcevol's guide for enabling volunteering. The aim of this guide is to help non-profits identify and remove barriers to better enable volunteering within your organisation. During this guide, we'll first take a look at what we mean by a barrier in the context of volunteering and why it's important to take a proactive approach to removing and reducing barriers. We'll then explore 5 different types of barrier in detail, including some common examples of each type and some actions that you can take to remove or reduce them. A barrier is a circumstance or obstacle which stops people from volunteering or from continuing to volunteer. Barriers come in many different forms, with some being easier to identify and remove than others. When faced with a barrier, many people will simply not volunteer or not return to volunteer rather than letting you know about the barrier or asking for help to remove it. This could be because they don't want special treatment, they're embarrassed, or they think nothing can be done. For this reason, it's important to take a proactive approach to barriers so you don't miss out on great volunteers. Let's take a closer look at the 5 different barrier types and some examples of each. External barriers are outside our control, but we can still act to remove or reduce them. For example, transportation. For in-person volunteering, volunteers are usually expected to make their own way to and from the volunteering site. This can be a problem for anyone with limited transport options. Not all volunteers will be able to drive or have access to a car, and accessible public transport isn't available everywhere or may not run at the times it's needed. Actions. Make an effort to familiarise yourself with local public transport options, for example, where the nearest bus stop or train station is and how frequent the services are. This is useful information to pass on to potential volunteers. Be aware that some volunteers may need to leave exactly on time, or even slightly earlier, to make sure they aren't waiting for too long, or to avoid missing the last service and being left stranded. Another external barrier could be finances. The cost of transportation, childcare, and other out-of-pocket expenses associated with volunteering can be major barriers for some people, especially if they're living on a low income. Actions. Make sure volunteers know if your organisation is able to cover expenses. Review your system for claims and reimbursements to make sure it's quick and easy for volunteers to use. Tell volunteers about any remote or virtual opportunities that your organisation might offer, as these types of roles can often be carried out with minimal or no financial commitment from volunteers. One final example of an external barrier is the weather. If access to your volunteering site is impacted by the weather, or if the site itself becomes very hot or cold, this can be more than just an inconvenience for some volunteers, potentially exacerbating the symptoms of existing health problems. Actions. As the winter months approach, check that plans are in place for snow and ice to be removed from walkways and parking areas, especially designated parking areas for people with disabilities. Open windows, turn heating off, and consider using fans to help circulate air during the warm summer months. Understand that some volunteers may not be able to volunteer on days of extreme weather. Check how your volunteers are doing and make sure they aren't putting themselves at risk by trying to volunteer as usual. Encourage them to take a break if needed and return to volunteering when the weather is back to normal. Environment and systems barriers exist within an organisation and its operations. For example, lack of flexibility. Insisting that volunteers meet rigid requirements on what, how, and when things need to be done may be necessary sometimes, but it will not work in all cases. For example, some people tire more easily or are unable to concentrate on one task for a long period of time. If we aren't flexible enough to accommodate these differences, volunteers will be unhappy, become discouraged, and may decide to leave. Actions. Letting volunteers do a task slightly differently, encouraging 2 volunteers to share a task, or allowing flexible completion times can all make volunteering more enjoyable and sustainable. When delegating tasks, consider the abilities and capacities of individual volunteers. Always try to adapt tasks to volunteers and not volunteers to tasks. Another example of an environment and systems barrier is the volunteering environment. If the environment is chaotic and stressful, or if a volunteer doesn't feel welcome, they're unlikely to return. Even an environment where the same volunteers attend on a regular basis and everyone knows each other can be intimidating for a new volunteer. Actions. Make sure every volunteer session is structured and clear, for example by having a standard welcome or briefing at the beginning and a debrief at the end. Be open and friendly. Smile and show volunteers at every session how happy you are to have them as part of the team. Have realistic expectations and be patient. New volunteers will probably make mistakes and may need extra guidance for a while. Allow room for adjustment and gaining experience. One final example of an environment and systems barrier is other volunteers. We all hold within us a host of mistaken impressions and stereotypes about people from different backgrounds. A lack of understanding and/or misplaced fear can mean that some volunteers are ignored by others during a session, or treated in a rude or condescending way. This makes the volunteering experience unpleasant and can easily drive people away. Actions. Lead by example. Treat all volunteers equally and with respect. Do not ignore unfriendly behaviour. When briefing new volunteers, make sure they're aware that your organisation welcomes volunteers from all backgrounds and walks of life, and will always work with individuals to ensure the volunteer experience meets their needs, including making reasonable adjustments where required. Provide examples of some common adjustments, such as those needed for mobility or communication, to help volunteers understand why some people may not be able to help with certain tasks, or may need to approach a task in a different way. Accessibility barriers are often physical issues with a volunteering site. These can be related to arriving at the site. If your site is difficult to find or lacks facilities such as outdoor lighting during the darker months, this can make people feel uneasy or unsafe and less likely to volunteer. Designated parking areas are also important for people with disabilities. If your site doesn't have a designated parking area, this may prevent some people from volunteering or even endanger their health and safety. Actions. Review the pre-session information that you send to volunteers to make sure everyone knows how to find the volunteering site quickly and easily, and what facilities are available, such as a designated parking area, bicycle racks, and so on. If there is no designated parking area for people with disabilities, take steps to fix this. This may be easier than you think, for example, turning 3 existing spaces into 2 designated spaces instead. Accessibility barriers can also arise when trying to enter a volunteering site. Buildings or facilities that are not physically accessible to everyone can make volunteers feel challenged, unwanted, and unappreciated. Even if your site is physically accessible, if this isn't immediately obvious, for example, if an accessible entrance is not the main entrance, volunteers may be put off. Similarly, if meetings or special events organised away from the volunteering site are held in locations that are not physically accessible, this suggests that certain people are not invited. Actions. Consider making changes to the way your volunteering site is used, for example, so the accessible entrance is the entrance for everyone. If this isn't possible, make sure to display clear signage at every session. Make a list of accessible venues for all the types of events that your organisation might hold for volunteers, and refer to it at the planning stage. Whether it's a volunteer social, training session, or team meeting, everyone should be able to attend. One final example of an accessibility barrier relates to accommodations at a volunteering site. Impediments inside the site, such as narrow doorways and uneven floors, may prevent some volunteers from moving around and using the facilities provided. Some buildings may have accommodations which appear usable but could in fact be dangerous, such as a ramp that is too steep or has no guardrails. Improper or inadequate accommodations are the same as no accommodations at all. Actions. When showing new volunteers around your volunteering site, ask if they think anything can be done to make the space more usable. Arrange to inspect the site with someone from a local disability organisation. Make a note of their suggestions for improvement and action as many as you can. If your organisation doesn't own the volunteering site and the owner is struggling to make improvements, think of a way your organisation could help, for example by making a financial contribution or spending time organising logistics. Disability-specific barriers arise from different types of disability. For example, limits to mobility or physical exertion. Some disabilities limit mobility, or their advance can lead to poor health and physical functioning. Facing physical limitations and feeling unable to contribute in the same way as others can be demoralising for some volunteers. Actions. When briefing new volunteers at the start of a session, if relevant to the volunteer role, remember to ask if any physical tasks might be difficult, for example, tasks involving standing, walking, lifting, or carrying. Be prepared to reorganise or divide tasks to accommodate volunteers who need less strenuous activities. Consider adapting tasks if possible to make them less physically demanding, for example, sitting down instead of standing, or offering a buddy for support. Another example of a disability-specific barrier is hearing impairment. A person with a hearing impairment may hear nothing at all, or may miss some words in a conversation. They may be unable to follow verbal instructions. The inability to hear clearly, combined with the frustration of not having alternative methods of communication, can drive people away from volunteering. Actions. If possible, allow volunteers with hearing impairments to volunteer in spaces that have little or no background noise. Make sure that a written summary of your organisation's standard volunteer introduction or briefing and instructions for key tasks are available if needed. Provide written information, for example a clear agenda, in advance of any meetings. This helps everyone to prepare, contribute, and get the most out of the meeting. Another example of a disability-specific barrier is visual impairment. This can include not being able to see anything, partial vision, or in some cases, tunnel vision. The inability to see, or to see clearly, can prevent volunteers from undertaking certain tasks, and can also be a barrier to non-verbal communication such as visual cues and body language. Actions. Provide instructions and information in alternative formats, such as large print or audio file. Make sure that volunteers are able to use areas with good lighting if needed. Identify and assign tasks that don't require perfect vision, or recommend alternative roles that might be a better fit. One final example of a disability-specific barrier is environmental sensitivity. Some people with neurological conditions, including many autistic people, experience hypersensitivity to environmental factors, such as bright lights, sounds, and smells. This can be physically and emotionally draining during a busy volunteer session and lead to sensory overload, exhaustion, or burnout. Actions. Help volunteers to protect their senses. For example, allow volunteers to wear sunglasses or a hat under bright fluorescent lights. Allow volunteers to wear earplugs or headphones in noisy spaces. Avoid using strong scents, such as air fresheners or cleaning products. Make sure that assigned tasks are straightforward and similar each week. Be flexible with timings, for example, for specific tasks or the start of volunteering sessions, to help volunteers avoid large groups of people if needed. Internalized barriers exist within an individual, for example, feelings of worthlessness. These feelings can stem from challenging life circumstances or a real or perceived lack of education or experience, which leads us to think that we have nothing to contribute. Some people with disabilities especially have been told throughout their lives that they can't do certain things or aren't as useful or competent as other people. Feelings of worthlessness create a barrier to volunteering, as people may not consider volunteering or may give up on volunteering if they don't see themselves or their contribution as valuable. Actions. Make sure to tell volunteers when they're doing a good job. We often notice when someone is doing something well, but we don't always say it out loud. Praise and highlight the positives and the progress that your volunteers are making. Speak to your colleagues or manager if you're stuck for ideas or unsure what kind of recognition or reward is appropriate. Remember that criticism should always be constructive. If something can be improved, explain how and why. Then allow space for improvement. Resist the temptation to take over and do it yourself. Make sure volunteers know what free training is offered by your organisation, for example, by mentioning it in your volunteer briefing or debriefing, or in your volunteer newsletter. Training helps to develop confidence and feelings of competence. Another example of an internalised barrier is a reluctance to ask for help. This often stems from embarrassment or politeness. Not wanting to bother others or feel like a burden makes some people reluctant to ask for help or to accept help when they need it, even if it's their right, for example, an adjustment or accommodation for a disability. Actions. Ask both new and existing volunteers at the start of each session if there's anything they might need a bit of extra help with. Make sure volunteers feel comfortable asking for an alternative task if they're finding something difficult, for whatever reason. Keep an eye on volunteers while they carry out their tasks, so you know if they're struggling and can offer help as needed. If a volunteer is reluctant to accept help, they may be worried about seeming incapable. Try to reassure them and continue to offer help. The aim of this guide was to help nonprofits identify and remove barriers in order to better enable volunteering. To achieve this aim, we've looked at what we mean by a barrier in the context of volunteering, why it's important to take a proactive approach to barriers, 5 types of barrier along with some common examples, suggested actions for removing or reducing different barriers. Thank you for taking the time to watch this guide. For bespoke resources and consultation services, please email hello@resourcevol.com.